Hey everybody, it's Tripl-L, and now let's talk some One Piece. So, One Piece episode 806 came out over the weekend, and with it, we got the reveal in the anime of Luffy's Gear 4th variation type form, Tank Man. It was a pretty cool episode. Like, when this form was first revealed in the original manga, it was kind of cool, because this was a point where we could get excited about the any kind of surprises that Gear 4th still had for the viewer. And at that time, there were still a lot of questions that I had about this variation of Gear 4th and just what it could do and whether or not it was actually going to be a serious contender for forms showing up in One Piece. Like, would it be something that Luffy would again use, or was this a very situational based thing? And then with episode 806, my questions came up again, and I decided, let's take a good look at Gear 4th and see what's actually going on with the Gear 4th variations. So this video, we're pretty much going to be doing that, just looking at it. It's pretty much going to be explaining what we know about both variations of Gear 4th and try and speculate, like, what exactly are the rules and how exactly do the forms differentiate themselves from each other. So let's just get into it. So when Luffy first revealed Gear 4th, he added Bound Man to the Gear 4th form. This was really important because this caused a lot of people to speculate that there were more variations of Gear 4th, and we got that confirmation with the reveal of the Gear 4th Tank Man, and that showed up in chapter 842 and episode 806, as I noted before. Well, one thing to note is that this is not the true Tank Man form, rather being the full version, and that's obvious if you watch the episode. But it's funny that this is a variation of a variation. We will have to be mindful of that little fact though, because it does kind of change what Tank Man probably truly is. So one of the big questions to ask, for me at least at this point, was is Tank Man a one-off variation? Like, are we only going to see it in Whole Cake Island, or are we going to see it sometime again in the future? Right now, my gamble is we're probably going to see it again. The full version of Tank Man might be a one-off, but Tank Man as a concept may not be. But if it is its own legitimate thing, then what's going on mechanically? What makes it so different from Bound Man? Figuring out the differences here could help us figure out the differences for other variations. So being under the umbrella of Gear 4th, it means we're getting a form that's based around Muscle Balloon, Luffy inflating his muscles, and then the extreme Haki control. From looking at the two forms, it looks like Luffy is varying the location of the inflation and the default Haki location. Looking at the inflation first, Tank Man requires much more air than Bound Man does. This, however, implies that a larger form is part of the Tank Man configuration. Now, Luffy was already gigantic because he gorged on biscuits, but thanks to Nami's observations, we know he got even bigger, which would imply that the base Tank Man form is bigger than Bound Man, but may not be as big as the full version. And again, we can say that it's bigger than Bound Man just because of the air intake being wildly different. Another note is that Luffy's arms seem smaller in Tank Man as opposed to Bound Man, and it's tough to say if that's actually the case because this could be the animators messing up with proportions, but comparing the palm sizes of each form and keeping it relative to Luffy's head, you'll see the relative sizes coming out. It looks like the palm size of Bound Man is bigger than the palm size of Tank Man. Again, this point is a bit more subjective, but it would make sense since Tank Man doesn't really focus on striking power. Now let's talk Haki. There's a few differences here, the obvious one being the flame pattern on Luffy's torso, but before that there's a cooler one in that Luffy's legs don't have Haki on them. And now this one was kind of hard to figure out because we have this shot from the anime, and this was the only shot I could find of Luffy's legs, and in this one we see that Luffy's legs are normal, they're not colored with the Haki, but it also shows his arms being normal, which is incorrect. So thankfully the manga comes in and we see more of Luffy's legs here, although it's still not a great shot, but we can see that they don't have Haki on them. Now this makes sense. When Luffy is using Tank Man, in the anime in particular, this is very pronounced, we don't see him moving around. So Tank Man from this we can assume is not as mobile as Bound Man, implying that the Tank Man form is about standing your ground and reflecting attacks. Which takes us into the default Haki setup for Tank Man. So obviously the pattern is different. In Bound Man, the pattern originates from the limbs and encroaches on the upper chest, while in Tank Man, the Haki encroaches from Luffy's lower abdomen, taking up the majority of Luffy's lower body and all of his back. Now this would be the end of it, but thanks to the commentary of villains, we know that the Tank Man Haki armor is maybe of a slightly different characteristic than the Bound Man Haki armor. We know that in Bound Man, Luffy can still cover his abdomen with Haki if he needs to, instead of just having it naturally coated. We saw this with Doflamingo. With this one though, we had Doflamingo give us the info that it was still hard but rubbery, meaning that it still had the give that rubber affords you and would bounce back pretty quickly, while also stopping any kind of penetrating force from harming Luffy. So it was elastic force pretty much. With Tankman, we see that this Haki setup is harder than the Bound Man Haki setup, because we saw a situation where Cracker's sword was able to slash Luffy while he was in Bound Man, but then the sword couldn't slash anymore once we went into Tankman. Thanks to Cracker's observations as well, we also know that the Tankman is both soft and hard, since Cracker wasn't able to distinguish between the two, which ultimately means it's a solid defense and has more absorbing potential than Bound Man, since it was able to swallow up Cracker instead of just bouncing him off immediately like it did with Doflamingo. On that note, we can't ignore that most likely the absorbing ability is coming in from the increased air intake. There's also the possibility that Luffy's extra fat is causing it, but for this one we can kind of err on the side of caution and just say no, it's probably the air intake, since we know there's a larger volume of air within Luffy's body. Anyway, from this we can clearly see that the Tankman form focuses on the quality that we saw from Bound Man when Doflamingo struck it all those episodes ago, namely that it focuses on being able to absorb an attack and rebound it or reflect it back out. Pretty much amping up the elastic potential and the elastic, I don't know what word we can say for when elastic potential energy turns into kinetic energy. Oh yeah, well, that energy conversion. Pretty much it ramps that up. So when we're talking about the regular Tankman, keeping all these things in mind, we probably have a form that's giving us lower mobility, but it instead focuses on defense, standing your ground, and taking opponent attacks and reflecting opponent attacks back at them by somehow sucking them into your body in a really weird way. Seeing the differences though, from this you can say that it seems like Bound Man focuses on mobility and being able to hit the enemy, while Tankman focuses on heavier defenses, which would imply that another variation could possibly focus on striking power. And that's a strange thought, since we have seen that Bound Man, it has a lot of destructive potential with its strikes already, but if we keep in mind that Bound Man also had some great feats of defense, as we saw with Doflamingo's kick, and then seeing with Tankman that those qualities were heightened, it is reasonable to assume that Luffy could have a variation of Gear 4th that has disproportionately large arms, and then also the same mobility issues that Tankman has. After seeing Tankman, it does seem that Bound Man, its whole deal was it was a more balanced approach, allowing Luffy the mobility, the striking power, and defenses, whereas Tankman showed that Luffy does have the potential to have more defenses. It's a pretty interesting thing, so I think having the idea that Luffy can have more striking power, I think that's fair to say at this stage. But anyway, that's my general breakdown on Gear 4th and the two forms that we have so far. It's pretty interesting stuff. I'm excited to see if this holds true. It'd be pretty sad if we only have Bound Man and Tankman. I would assume there's at least one more. We have mobility, we have defense, so I think one more with striking power would be a pretty cool thing to have. Whether or not we'll see it in Whole Cake Island, that's up in the air, but still, it'd be cool. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any thoughts down below. So till next time, I hope you have a great day.